Jake Miller thought he was just rescuing a wounded brown horse from the harsh Montana winter. But when Thunder recovered, the animal's strange behavior led him deep into the wilderness to a discovery that would shatter everything he believed about his family's past and change his life forever. If this story captivates you, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who needs to hear a tale of unexpected connections and the power of persistence. Your support helps us bring more incredible stories to light. The wind cut across the Montana plains like a blade, carrying with it the promise of another terrible winter storm. Jake Miller stood on the worn porch of his family's ranch house, watching dark clouds gather on the horizon. At 42, he had the rough hands and steady eyes of a man who had spent his entire life working the land his grandfather had claimed over 100 years ago. The Miller Ranch spread across 3,000 acres of high country, where prairie grass met pine forest and the mountains rose like ancient guards against the sky. It was good land, hard won and harder kept, but it had been struggling for years. Cattle prices were down, drought had been terrible, and the bank bills were coming due more and more often. Jake pulled his worn cowboy hat lower against the wind and stepped down from the porch. His boots crunched on the frozen ground as he made his way toward the main barn, where his daily work awaited. The familiar routine of checking on the animals had become both a comfort and a reminder of everything he stood to lose. He was halfway to the barn when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the familiar sounds of his ranch. It was a horse's neigh, but wrong somehow, filled with pain and desperation. Jake stopped, his head tilted, listening carefully. The sound came again, fainter this time, from somewhere beyond the north pasture. Without hesitation, Jake changed direction, jogging toward the sound. As he reached the top of a small hill, he saw the source of the distress. Near the edge of his property line, where his land met the vast stretch of public wilderness, a horse lay collapsed in the snow. It was a magnificent brown horse, its coat a rich brown that shined even in the gray light of the approaching storm. But something was terribly wrong. The animal was on its side, its breathing hard, and as Jake drew closer, he could see dark stains in the snow around it. "Easy there, boy," Jake said softly, approaching slowly with his hands visible. The horse's eyes tracked his movement, smart and alert, despite its obvious pain. This was no wild Mustang. The animal's build and bearing spoke of good breeding, careful training. Jake knelt in the snow beside the horse, his experienced hands running gently along its neck and sides. What he found made his jaw clench with anger. This horse had been shot, not by a hunter's clean rifle shot, but by something smaller, meaner, maybe a small gun. Multiple wounds across the animal's side and legs. Not immediately life-threatening, but clearly designed to cause suffering. "What kind of monster does this to you, boy?" Jake whispered, his voice tight with fury. The horse's eyes met his, and in them Jake saw something that stopped him cold. Not just pain, but purpose. This animal had been trying to get somewhere, and whoever had shot him had been trying to stop him. Working quickly, Jake checked the injuries. The horse could be saved, but it would need immediate attention. He jogged back to the ranch house, grabbed his truck and horse trailer along with his medical supplies. Jake had been fixing up livestock for decades. When you lived this far from town, you learned to be your own animal doctor for everything short of surgery. Loading the injured horse took careful work. The brown horse was weak, but cooperative, as if he understood Jake was trying to help. Once they were back at the ranch, Jake settled the horse in his best stall, cleaned the wounds, and gave him antibiotics and pain medicine. "You're going to make it," Jake told the horse, stroking his neck gently. "But I've got to call you something while you heal up. How about Thunder? You've got the look of a strong spirit about you." The horse's ears turned forward at the name, and Jake could have sworn he saw approval in those smart brown eyes. Over the next week, Jake watched Thunder recover with amazing speed. The The horse had a strong body like iron, and a will to live that impressed even Jake, who had seen plenty of tough animals in his time. But as Thunder healed, something strange began to happen. The horse would stand at the north-facing window of his stall for hours, staring out toward the wilderness with an intensity that was almost human. When Jake let him out into the pen for exercise, Thunder would walk to the north fence and pace, neighing softly toward the distant hills. "What's out there, boy?" Jake would ask, but Thunder would only continue his restless pacing, his attention fixed on something only he could see. By the second week, the behavior had gotten stronger. Thunder would barely eat, spending most of his time at the fence, calling toward the wilderness. When Jake approached with hay or grain, the horse would look at him with such obvious frustration that it was almost funny if it weren't so concerning. Jake had seen animals miss their home territory before, but this was different. Thunder wasn't homesick. He was on a mission. On a cold Tuesday morning, Jake arrived at the barn to find Thunder's stall door open and the horse gone. Heart pounding, he rushed outside, expecting to see Thunder heading for the highway or lost somewhere on the ranch. Instead, he found the horse standing calmly by the gate that led to the wilderness area, his head turned expectantly toward Jake. "You want me to follow you?" Jake said aloud, the realization hitting him like a punch. That's what this is about. Thunder took a few steps toward the wilderness, then stopped and looked back, his meaning clear. Jake stood at the crossroads of decision. Every practical instinct told him to put Thunder back in his stall and lock the door properly. He had work to do, bills to pay, a ranch to run. But something deeper, some instinct developed by decades of working with animals, told him that Thunder's behavior wasn't random. The horse had survived being shot, had somehow found his way to Jake's ranch, and now was trying to lead him somewhere specific. "All right, boy," Jake said finally. "You win. But if we're going into the wilderness, we're doing it right." An hour later, Jake sat on his own horse, a steady quarter horse named Duke, with Thunder moving purposefully ahead of them. Jake had packed supplies for a day trip: water, food, first aid kit, his rifle, and a GPS device. The storm clouds were building, but they still had several hours before the weather turned nasty. Thunder moved with the confidence of an animal following a familiar trail, though Jake could see no path. They climbed steadily into the foothills through groups of aspen and pine trees, the air growing thinner and colder with each mile. Duke followed willingly, though Jake could sense his horse's confusion at this strange trip. After 3 hours of steady climbing, they reached the top of a ridge, and Jake got his first clear view of their destination. In a small valley below, partially hidden by a thick group of evergreen trees, smoke rose from the chimney of what looked like an old cabin. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This was deep wilderness, miles from any road or official trail. What was someone doing out here? And why had Thunder been so desperate to lead him to this place? As they went down into the valley, Jake's worry grew. The cabin looked old but well-maintained, and there was something off about the whole setup. No vehicle was visible, no obvious way for supplies to be brought in. The windows were covered with what looked like heavy curtains, and despite the smoke from the chimney, there were no other signs of normal human life. Thunder led them directly to the cabin, then stopped about 50 yards away. The horse was shaking now, not from cold, but from something else. Excitement, fear, or both. Jake got off his horse and approached the cabin on foot, his hand resting on the rifle at his side. The silence was heavy, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant sound of his own heartbeat. He was 20 feet from the front door when he saw them. Heavy chains wrapped around the door handles, locked with a thick padlock. The sight hit him like a physical blow. Someone was locked inside this cabin, and they had been there long enough for whoever was holding them to feel confident enough to leave. Jake's military training from his younger days kicked in. He moved quickly but quietly around the outside of the cabin, checking for other exits, other threats. What he found made his blood run cold. The windows weren't just covered. They were barred on the outside. This wasn't a cabin. It was a prison. He returned to the front door and examined the lock. It was old but solid. Jake pulled a multi-tool from his pack and went to work on it. Years of ranch work had taught him to be resourceful with locks and mechanical problems. After several tense minutes, the lock clicked open. Jake unwound the chains and let them drop to the ground with a metallic clatter. He drew his rifle, though some instinct told him the real danger wasn't inside the cabin. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The interior was dim, lit only by the glow from a fireplace. Jake stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The cabin was simply furnished. A small kitchen area, a couple of chairs, a table covered with what looked like old papers and books. "Hello," Jake called softly. "Is anyone here?" The answer came as a weak cough from a back room. Jake moved toward the sound, his heart hammering. In a small bedroom, lying on a narrow bed, was an elderly woman. She was frighteningly thin, her silver hair tangled and messy, but her eyes were alert and smart. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely able to be heard. "Help me." Jake was at her side immediately, checking her pulse, her breathing. She was weak, dehydrated, but alive. "Ma'am, my name is Jake Miller. I'm going to get you out of here. Can you tell me your name?" "Grace," she managed. "Grace Watson. How did you?" "No one comes up here. A horse led me here," Jake said, gently helping her sit up. "A brown horse named Thunder. He seemed to know exactly where to find you." Grace's eyes widened, and despite her weakness, she gripped Jake's arm with surprising strength. "Thunder. My Thunder. He's alive." Jake's mind spun. This was her horse. Somehow, Thunder had escaped whatever had happened here and made his way to Jake's ranch, then led him back to find Grace. "He's fine, ma'am. He's right outside. But we need to get you some help." "Who did this to you? How long have you been here?" Grace's story came out in whispered pieces. She lived alone on a small homestead about 10 miles from where Jake had found her. Her nephew, a man named Steve Harris, had been pressuring her to sell her land to a mining company. The property sat on what geological surveys suggested was a significant mineral deposit worth millions. When Grace refused to sell, Steve had taken matters into his own hands. He'd come to her house 3 weeks ago with 2 other men, claiming they were taking her somewhere safe while they sorted out the legal issues. Instead, they brought her to this remote cabin and told her she'd stay here until she agreed to sign over the property. "Steve comes every few days," Grace whispered. "Brings just enough food and water to keep me alive. He says when I'm ready to be reasonable, I can sign the papers and go home. But I know he's lying. Once I sign, I'll never leave this place." Jake felt a familiar cold rage building in his chest. He'd dealt with his share of land grabbers and con artists over the years, but this was beyond anything he'd encountered. "Grace, do you know why Thunder would have come to my ranch specifically? How would he know to find me?" Grace's eyes studied his face carefully, as if searching for something. "What did you say your name was?" "Jake Miller. My family's ranch is about 15 miles southeast of here." Grace's hand went to her throat, her eyes filling with tears. "Miller. The Miller Ranch. Oh my God. You're Thomas Miller's grandson, aren't you?" Jake's world tilted. His grandfather's name was rarely spoken these days, and he certainly hadn't expected to hear it in a cabin prison in the wilderness. "Yes, ma'am. But how do you—" "Your grandfather saved my life once," Grace said, her voice stronger now. "It was 1943. I was just 19. My family's wagon broke down in a blizzard, and we would have frozen to death if Thomas Miller hadn't found us. He brought us to his ranch, gave us shelter for 3 days until the storm passed. He was a good man, the kindest man I ever met. Jake sat back on his heels, stunned. I never heard that story. There's more, Grace continued. Your grandfather and I, we became close during those 3 days. After the war, he asked my father for permission to court me. We were going to be married. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. What happened? Grace's eyes were distant now, lost in memory. My family moved away that spring. My father got a job offer in California, and he wanted a fresh start. Thomas promised to come find me, but she shrugged sadly. Life happened. I married someone else, had children, built a life, but I never forgot him. When I inherited my grandfather's property here in Montana 20 years ago, I came back, partly hoping. Well, hoping I might see him again. But by then he'd been gone for years. Jake's mind was racing. All the pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Grace. When Thunder got away from Steve, he didn't run home. He came looking for my family. He remembered the Miller Ranch from when you used to ride him over here. I did, Grace confirmed. When I first moved back, I used to ride these hills all the time. Thunder and I would sometimes go past your ranch. I could never bring myself to stop, but I always wondered about Thomas's family. What had become of them? A sound outside made them both freeze. The distant rumble of an ATV engine. Jake moved quickly to the window and looked out through a gap in the curtains. A man on a four-wheeler was approaching the cabin, a rifle slung across his back. That's Steve, Grace whispered, terror creeping into her voice. Jake's training took over. Grace, I need you to stay calm. Can you move? I think so. Good. When I give you the signal, I want you to get up and go to that back corner behind the bed. Stay low and don't make a sound no matter what happens. Jake positioned himself beside the front door, his rifle ready. The ATV engine cut off, and he could hear footsteps crunching on the frozen ground outside. A key rattled in the lock, or tried to. Jake heard a confused curse as Steve realized the chains were gone. The door flew open and Steve Harris stepped inside, his rifle raised. He was a big man, probably in his 40s, with the soft look of someone who'd spent more time in offices than outdoors. His eyes swept the room, taking in Jake's presence with shock and rage. Who the hell are you? Steve demanded, swinging his rifle toward Jake. The man who's going to put you in prison, Jake replied calmly. Put the gun down, Steve. It's over. Instead of complying, Steve's face twisted with fury. You don't understand what you're interfering with, Cowboy. This is business. Big business. That old woman is sitting on a fortune, and she's too stubborn to see reason. So you decided to torture her into compliance? Jake said, his voice deadly quiet. Real businesslike. It would have worked too, if that damn horse hadn't. Steve stopped, his eyes widening as he saw Thunder through the open door. That horse should be dead. I shot him myself. You missed the vital organs, Jake said. Lucky for Grace, unlucky for you. Steve's calculation was visible on his face. He was clearly trying to decide whether to shoot Jake or try to talk his way out of the situation. Jake could see the exact moment when greed won over caution. You know what? Maybe this works out better. 2 accidents are easier to explain than one. Old woman got lost in the wilderness. Small-town rancher went looking for her. Tragic winter storm caught you both. Steve was raising his rifle when Jake moved. Years of ranch work had kept him in better shape than Steve's soft lifestyle, and Jake's military training had never really left him. He dove to the side as Steve fired, the shot going wide, then came up with his own rifle ready. Drop it, Jake commanded. Instead, Steve tried to work the bolt on his rifle for another shot. Jake didn't hesitate. His shot took Steve in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying. Steve went down hard, clutching his wounded arm and screaming. Jake was on him immediately, kicking the fallen rifle well out of reach. Grace, you okay? I'm fine, came her shaky voice from behind the bed. Jake pulled out his cell phone, not surprised to find no signal this deep in the wilderness, but he'd come prepared for that possibility. From his pack, he pulled out a satellite communicator, a recent purchase he'd made for situations exactly like this. Within minutes, he'd sent an emergency message to the sheriff's department, complete with GPS coordinates. Help would be on the way, though it would take time to reach them in this remote location. Jake used some old bedding to bandage Steve's shoulder. He wasn't going to let the man bleed to death no matter what he'd done. Then he helped Grace to the main room, settling her in a chair by the fire while they waited for rescue. "I still can't believe Thunder found you," Grace said, her voice stronger now that the immediate danger had passed. It's like he knew somehow that Thomas's family would help. Jake looked out at the brown horse, who was standing calmly near the cabin, as if he'd known all along that this was how things would end. Animals remember more than we give them credit for. And loyalty. Real loyalty doesn't die with time. 2 hours later, the wilderness around the cabin was filled with the sound of helicopters and rescue vehicles that had managed to reach them via old logging roads. Steve was airlifted to a hospital under guard, while Grace was taken to receive proper medical care. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Steve's scheme. He'd been working with a mining company that had been quietly buying up land in the area, often through less than ethical means. Grace's property was the last piece they needed for a major extraction operation, and Steve stood to make millions from the deal. But there was more. In Grace's cabin, investigators found a collection of documents that told a story spanning decades. Grace had kept every letter Thomas Miller had written to her after her family moved to California. Letters that revealed he had indeed tried to find her, had traveled to California twice looking for her family. Letters that told of his heartbreak when he couldn't locate them and his eventual decision to return to Montana and build the life he dreamed of sharing with her. The last letter, dated just 5 years before Thomas's death, contained a revelation that left Jake speechless. His grandfather had discovered that Grace had returned to Montana, but by then he was ill, too proud to reach out as a sick old man to the woman he'd loved as a young one. Instead, he changed his will, leaving a significant portion of the ranch to Grace if she could ever be found. Jake had been living with the financial struggles of the ranch for years, never knowing that his grandfather had already provided a solution. The legal paperwork was complex, involving decades-old wills and property laws, but the intent was clear. Grace Watson was as much an owner of the Miller Ranch as Jake himself. But Grace had a different idea. "I don't want your ranch, Jake," she said when they met at the lawyer's office weeks later. "What I want is to see your grandfather's dream finally come true." Together, they hatched a plan that honored both the past and the future. Grace would remain the co-owner of the ranch, but rather than dividing the property, they would combine their resources, Grace's mineral-rich land and Jake's operational ranch, to create something neither could have achieved alone. They established the Miller-Watson Ranch, a working cattle operation that also included a horse rescue program. Grace's mining revenues would fund the operation, allowing them to take in horses like Thunder, animals that had been abused, abandoned, or were simply unwanted. The day they officially opened the rescue program, Jake stood in the main pen watching Grace work with a group of rescued horses. At 76, she moved with the easy confidence of someone who had found her purpose. Thunder stood nearby, the unofficial leader of the herd, his coat shining in the afternoon sun. "You know," Grace said, approaching Jake with a smile, "I think Thomas would have loved this." Jake nodded, looking out over the pastures where 24 horses grazed peacefully. "I think you're right. He always said the land should take care of those who couldn't take care of themselves." Thunder trotted over to them, nuzzling Grace's shoulder with obvious affection. The horse that had started this entire journey with his desperate mission through the snow, was now the foundation sire of their breeding program. His intelligence and loyalty, traits they were working to pass on to future generations. As the sun set over the Montana hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Jake reflected on how a single act of kindness, rescuing an injured horse, had led to the discovery of a family secret that spanned generations. He thought about the thin threads of connection that bind lives together, how loyalty and love can survive decades of separation and loss. The Miller-Watson Ranch had become more than either Jake or Grace could have imagined alone. It was a place of healing for animals and humans alike. It was proof that some stories don't end with separation and heartbreak. Sometimes, if you're patient enough, if you're brave enough to follow where love leads, they get a second chance at the ending they were always meant to have. And it all started because one remarkable horse refused to give up, refused to forget, and somehow knew that the descendants of Thomas Miller would honor the bond their ancestor had forged with the woman who had never stopped loving him. This incredible story reminds us that sometimes the most unexpected connections lead to the most extraordinary discoveries. If this tale touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that loyalty and love can bridge any gap and that family extends far beyond blood relations. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories of courage, connection, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and animals. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful reminders that miracles happen when we're brave enough to follow where they lead.